January 12, 1944, south of San Pietro, Italy. The men of a U.S. infantry battalion crouched inside the shattered stone farmstead that had become their last functioning position on the ridge. German pressure had severed their supply line 2 days earlier, leaving their ammunition rationed and their food almost gone. Soldiers moved with the sluggishness of men who had been fighting on empty stomachs, counting the remaining cans and scraping the bottoms of metal mess tins for anything left. In the cramped rear corner of the farmhouse, a U.S. Army cook named Private First Class Alan Brooks studied the scattered remains of the battalion's food stores. The others mocked him earlier when he insisted that a single salt barrel he had dragged from a ruined shed could keep them alive. To them it was another desperate field joke, something to distract from the hunger clawing at their discipline. But as the last crates were opened and the truth set in, eyes turned toward him. The battalion had one chance left, and it rested inside that battered, white-rimmed barrel, and the plan no one had taken seriously. The Italian campaign had become one of the most punishing battlegrounds faced by American forces in Europe. After landing at Salerno in September 1943 and fighting their way north through a maze of ridgelines, stone villages, and fortified German positions, U.S. units learned that Italy was not a single advance but a stairway of obstacles, each step defended with deliberate, expert resistance. By early 1944, the push toward the Liri Valley and the approaches to Cassino required battalions to hold exposed ground for longer than planned, often without reliable roads or consistent supply routes. For the Americans fighting south of San Pietro, the situation had become especially strained. Their position lay along a narrow mule track that twisted up the ridge before dropping into a shallow basin the Germans had learned to shell with pinpoint predictability. Every time the battalion's supply jeeps attempted the climb, German observers reported back to mortar teams waiting across the valley. Truck engines echoed too loudly, pack mules moved too slowly, and men carrying crates made silhouettes that were easy to track. Several resupply attempts were driven back or forced to scatter before reaching the forward line. Food shortages crept in gradually. At first, soldiers noticed the mess lines serving smaller portions. Then came meals built from whatever components happened to remain. A thin vegetable mix stretched with water, biscuits crushed into improvised stews, and the last cans of meat rationed between entire squads. The men understood the pattern. Once a battalion was fixed in place without reinforcement, supply officers prioritized ammunition, medical kits, and radio batteries. Everything else became secondary, including food. Cooks usually operated several hundred yards behind the front, using portable stoves and insulated containers to bring meals forward. But those routines depended on stable routes and predictable movement. When front lines shifted suddenly or companies were cut off, cooks became improvisers, scavengers, and, when needed, lifelines. Still, no one expected them to solve large-scale starvation. That responsibility rested with the logistics chain, and when the chain broke, everyone suffered. The battalion's officers understood the scale of the problem long before the men felt it. They recorded every failed delivery attempt in clipped notations sent back to regimental headquarters. They requested airdropped containers, but German flak along the ridge forced aircraft to release loads too far from the intended drop zone. What little reached American hands was scattered, damaged, or insufficient. Commanders issued steady orders to hold the ridge, even as each passing day stretched the battalion's endurance thinner. Inside the farmstead that served as the battalion's makeshift command post, the cooks worked with what they had left: a handful of half-spoiled vegetables, a few pieces of tough meat, some dried legumes, and limited salt. When their supply of salt dwindled, the cooks expected requests to conserve it for medical needs or sanitation. Instead, it was the cook everyone overlooked, Alan Brooks, who began eyeing the salt more carefully than anyone else. Brooks was known for his quiet manner and his habit of studying ingredients the way infantrymen studied maps. He had grown up helping in a family butcher shop in Ohio, where salt was not a seasoning but a tool. Soldiers teased him for the seriousness he brought to field cooking, calling him the professor or the chemist. To most of them, food in a combat zone was a simple matter of opening a can. To Brooks, it was a system of survival, one that could be manipulated with the right techniques. Yet even he had never attempted anything on the scale the battalion now required. As the food stocks shrank, the officers expected morale to follow. Hunger undermines strength, slows reaction time, and corrodes discipline with remarkable speed. Reports from other units showed how quickly men could falter when their bodies lacked fuel. The battalion sergeant major began rotating fatigued soldiers away from the sharpest fighting simply because their movements had grown sluggish. The medical officer warned that if the reduction in rations continued another 2 days, the battalion would be physically incapable of holding the ridge. That was when Brooks approached the officers with a request that made several men laugh outright. He wanted the abandoned salt barrel from the farmstead's rear shed transported into the kitchen area. The barrel had been used for storing agricultural brine and stood almost as tall as a man's waist. Its wood was warped, its iron hoops rusted, and its interior stained from old use. Soldiers joked that Brooks planned to cook in it, or worse, hide inside it during an attack. Brooks said little in return. He simply insisted the barrel contained the only chance they had to preserve what little edible material remained. Most believed he was clinging to some textbook idea that made no sense under combat conditions. Salt preservation, they argued, required time, tools, and stable conditions they did not have. And even if the concept worked, there wasn't enough food left to justify the effort. But Brooks did not drop the idea. He waited until the officers saw the bottom of the last ration crate, and only then repeated his request. This time no one laughed. Hunger had stripped away the luxury of doubt and forced the battalion to consider solutions they would have dismissed days earlier. That turning point, when the salt barrel shifted from joke to necessity, shaped everything that followed, leading directly into the deeper circumstances that defined the battalion's isolation and the pressure under which Brooks made his plan. The battalion's isolation had not happened overnight. In the days before the encirclement tightened, American commanders were pushing steadily toward the heights overlooking the Leary Valley, trying to fracture the German defensive belt anchoring the Gustav Line. The ridge south of San Pietro was intended as a temporary stepping point, a place to stage patrols and hold observation posts while armored elements shifted behind them. But the Germans, recognizing the tactical value of the ground, reacted with sharp counterattacks that forced the Americans into a defensive posture sooner than planned. The battalion formed a perimeter around the farmstead and the adjoining terraces, setting up machine gun nests along stone walls and using shallow depressions for cover. They expected relief within hours, but German units positioned across the valley made movement hazardous. What began as a brief hold became a prolonged contest of endurance. With communication lines strained and ammunition rationed, the battalion prioritized defensive stability above all else. That stability, however, came at the cost of mobility. When the chance to withdraw arose, they were too committed to pull back without risking a collapse of the regimental front. During the first 2 days, the soldiers barely noticed the impact on their food supply. Combat demanded their attention, and constant alerts kept everyone focused on the immediate dangers. Only when the intensity of engagements fluctuated did the men begin to recognize the subtle signs of ration decline. Breakfast portions had shrunk. Lunch often consisted of nothing more than thin broth. Dinner, once a small comfort in the chaos, became another reminder that supplies were dwindling far faster than expected. By the 3rd day, the battalion field kitchen had nothing left that fit any standard recipe. Brooks and the other cooks resorted to peeling the final vegetables down to soft cores, slicing the tough pieces into fragments small enough to soften in boiling water. They recovered a few scraps of cured meat from crates damaged during shelling and blended them into the mixture, trying to stretch protein content just enough to sustain the men. But it was clear to them, and to every officer watching, that these measures were not enough. The battalion commander, a major hardened by earlier fighting in North Africa, gathered his staff to discuss their options. Ammunition was low, but not yet critical. Medical supplies were sufficient for another day. Radio batteries were holding. Food, however, was the one element they could not replace. Starving soldiers could not maintain defensive posture. They could not react quickly, march effectively, or carry the loads combat demanded. A battalion on the edge of collapse would be unable to hold long enough for relief forces to break through. It was in this atmosphere of looming failure that Brooks's plan began to take shape. He had already examined the salt barrel, checking its structure and calculating how much brine could be restored with the supplies available. He knew that salt could pull moisture from meat, halting bacterial growth and stabilizing it long enough to stretch whatever they had left. He also knew the process could work rapidly under the right conditions. In his family's butcher shop, he had watched older craftsmen preserve cuts overnight when shortages forced them to work with haste. The method was simple, but not commonly used in the field. Most cooks lacked the experience to attempt it under combat pressure. Brooks's confidence came from memory, not theory. He remembered his father explaining how salt, properly applied, could keep meat edible long enough to survive unexpected delays in delivery. In wartime Italy, the principles were no different. The scale and stakes were simply higher. When he finally presented the idea in detail to the officers, they were skeptical. The battalion executive officer questioned whether the process could work quickly enough. The medical officer worried about contamination. The sergeant major pointed out they barely had enough salt to cover their remaining supplies. Brooks responded quietly, outlining a sequence of steps that would allow them to extract the maximum preservative effect from the materials they still possessed. The officers listened because they had no alternative. Their situation had deteriorated beyond normal protocol. Improvised solutions had become the only solutions. And as the last of the rations were inventoried, the numbers made the decision for them. Brooks's proposal offered a chance, however slim, that the battalion could sustain itself until reinforcements arrived. The men were informed late that evening. Some reacted with disbelief, others with grim acceptance. The jokes about the salt barrels stopped, replaced by a mixture of curiosity and anxiety. Soldiers watched as Brooks and the other cooks hauled the barrel toward the center of the farmstead, its heavy frame echoing against the stone floor. They saw him begin to clean the interior, preparing it as though he had done this 100 times before. The act alone steadied morale more than anyone expected. In a place where control had eroded hour by hour, the sight of one man working with conviction gave the battalion something to hold on to. What followed in the coming hours would shape not only their physical survival but their understanding of how resourcefulness could alter the course of a desperate stand, a development best understood through the different angles that defined the battalion's experience. When soldiers look back on the moments that kept them alive, they rarely recall strategies or terminology. They remember the human decisions made in the margins, acts of quiet bravery that did not resemble battlefield heroism but mattered just as much. For the men on the ridge, Brooks's insistence on pursuing his method was one of those moments. No one had ordered him to attempt anything. He could have accepted the dwindling supplies as an unavoidable part of combat and waited for the battalion to endure whatever consequences followed. Instead, he chose to shoulder a responsibility larger than his role required. The courage in Brooks's effort came not from facing enemy fire, though he worked within reach of German observation, but from risking the trust of men whose lives hung on the success of his approach. Soldiers were slow to place faith in unfamiliar solutions, especially when hunger sharpened frustrations. A failed attempt would not simply waste time, it could erode the battalion's last reserve of morale. Brooks understood this, yet pressed on, guiding the cooks with calm precision. He measured salt by instinct, checked each cut of meat with deliberate care, and spoke only when instructions were necessary. The steadiness of his actions created a sense of structure amid the uncertainty surrounding them. Even before the results appeared, the battalion began to see that his resolve offered a form of leadership they had not expected from a cook. The salt barrel plan was not a miracle. It was a process built on discipline and practical knowledge. Brooks started by preparing a brine mixture thick enough to halt bacterial growth but thin enough to coat every surface of the limited meat they still possessed. Working inside the dim interior of the farmstead, he boiled water over a small field stove, dissolving the last bags of salt slowly into the pot. The cooks moved with rhythmic efficiency, scraping residue from the sides, filtering impurities with cloth fragments, and pouring the solution into the barrel once the mixture thickened properly. Next came the preservation stage. Brooks layered each remaining piece of meat into the barrel, pressing them firmly to eliminate pockets of air where spoilage could accelerate. He poured brine between each layer, allowing the salt to draw moisture outward. The method reduced weight, tightened texture, and bought critical hours of stability. Vegetables that had begun to soften were trimmed, submerged, and sealed beneath the surface. Brooks's process was relentless, a continuous cycle of observation and adjustment. He checked the barrel every hour, ensuring the brine level remained high enough to fully cover the contents. To the soldiers watching from the edges of the room, the work seemed impossibly meticulous given their circumstances. Yet the precision was exactly what made it effective. Brooks was restoring a preservation system practiced for generations, adapting it under battlefield pressure. In doing so, he transformed scattered remnants of food into a resource the battalion could depend on long enough to endure the siege. Hunger was not the battalion's only threat. The psychological strain of being cut off wore at the men with increasing intensity. Nights felt longer, tempers shorter, and routine tasks heavier. Soldiers argued quietly over small issues. Patrols grew faster to anger. Fatigue blurred judgment. Officers noted the signs with concern. Emotional deterioration often preceded physical breakdown. By the time Brooks began preparing the salt barrel, the battalion was already nearing its limit. The strain also affected trust within the ranks. Men accustomed to clear procedures now faced uncertainties no manual could solve. They questioned whether command understood their situation, whether relief would arrive in time, whether the ridge was worth the suffering required to hold it. Against this backdrop of unease, the cook's efforts became a focal point for the battalion's hopes and doubts alike. Every movement around the barrel drew attention. Soldiers whispered about how long the preservation would take, whether it would spoil, and whether the results would taste like anything edible. The weight of these expectations settled on Brooks quietly but unmistakably. He felt the pressure behind each step he took, each adjustment he made, each instruction he gave. Yet he did not let the strain alter his steady pace. His calm presence had a stabilizing effect. The psychological tension running through the battalion eased slightly because the men saw one part of their chaotic world functioning with order and purpose. Their survival depended on many factors they could not control, but the sight of Brooks methodically shaping a solution reminded them that not everything was slipping beyond reach. The combined effect of courage, method, and strain shaped how the battalion experienced those critical hours and set the foundation for the deeper forces at play within the unit. A battalion cut off from supply cannot afford improvisation without structure. What kept the ridge from slipping into chaos was the discipline engraved into American infantry culture. Orders followed, routines preserved, and tasks executed even when hunger dulled concentration. As Brooks worked, the officers reinforced a strict schedule around him. Riflemen rotated through defensive positions with limited shifts to conserve energy. Machine gun teams were ordered to reduce unnecessary fire. Medics checked hydration levels. Platoon sergeants enforced rest periods, knowing exhaustion could become as dangerous as enemy fire. This atmosphere of discipline allowed Brooks's plan to function. Without coordinated movement, men would have interrupted the process, opened the barrel prematurely, or frozen the cooks with questions that slowed their work. Instead, the battalion treated the preservation effort as part of its defensive framework. Runners carried messages but kept distance from the kitchen area. Squad leaders instructed their men to remain patient and avoid speculation. Even small gestures mattered. Merely giving the cooks space helped maintain the precision the method required. The discipline extended beyond routine. Soldiers who had doubted Brooks now found themselves respecting the order he brought to the situation. They understood that preserving what remained required not only skill but restraint. In moments when frustration flared, officers reminded them that discipline had carried American units through worse in North Africa and Sicily. That steadiness, rooted in practice rather than emotion, ensured that the battalion's survival efforts unfolded without internal disruption. It was this controlled environment that allowed the next phase of the preservation to take hold. Every improvised solution carried inherent risks, and Brooks's plan was no exception. The first danger was contamination. A misjudged brine mixture, a single unclean surface, or a cut of meat left exposed too long could render the entire barrel useless. The medical officer hovered nearby at intervals, monitoring hygiene practices with the seriousness normally reserved for surgical procedures. He reminded the cooks that spoiled food might incapacitate soldiers faster than hunger. The second risk was operational. The barrel required time, hours of uninterrupted settling, periodic checks, and adjustments to maintain correct salinity. If the Germans intensified pressure or forced the battalion to shift positions, the cooks would have no chance to finish. The barrel could not be carried far, and any sudden movement could spill the mixture or expose the contents to air. Officers weighed these concerns privately, knowing the battalion's defensive line depended on stability long enough for the process to complete. The final risk was psychological. If the plan failed, morale might collapse beyond recovery. Soldiers needed a reason to believe they could outlast the siege, and Brooks's effort became that symbol. The officers understood the stakes. A failure would not merely return the battalion to starvation, it could fracture their unity. But risk is often the measure of necessity. With no alternatives left, the battalion accepted the danger, trusting that skill and determination would outweigh the variables working against them. Their willingness to take that chance revealed how desperation had reshaped their priorities and how one cook's idea had become central to their hopes. Even a skilled cook working with conviction cannot sustain a battalion alone. Once the men realized the plan was serious, small acts of support began appearing across the farmstead. Engineers reinforced the floor beneath the barrel with planks scavenged from a collapsed shed. A communications corporal loaned a spare battery lamp so Brooks could monitor the brine level through the night. Infantrymen on rest cycles volunteered to haul water, scrub surfaces, and trim vegetables to the precise sizes Brooks required. No one ordered them to help. They simply recognized that the survival of the battalion depended on every contribution. Officers coordinated these efforts with quiet efficiency. They ensured Brooks had priority access to what remained of the unit's fuel supply for boiling water. The medical staff provided cloth, soap, and antiseptics to keep the process sanitary. Runners adjusted their paths to avoid disturbing the work area. What began as a single man's idea had become a collective operation anchored by mutual reliance. This support shifted the atmosphere within the battalion. Men who had spent days feeling powerless against starvation now found purpose again. The cooperation built around the salt barrel restored a sense of shared struggle, replacing despair with momentum. Even under German pressure, the battalion began functioning with renewed coherence. Every individual saw that their actions contributed to the same outcome, giving the battalion a chance to endure. This unity, forged around an improvised solution and held together by discipline, risk, and support, shaped the moment when the battalion's fate reached its critical turning point. Through the night, the ridge remained tense. German mortar crews sent intermittent rounds onto the terraces, probing for weaknesses, listening for movements that might indicate an American withdrawal. Each impact rattled the farmstead's battered walls, sending dust drifting over the men crowded inside. Yet the cooks continued their work with unwavering focus. Brooks checked the barrel repeatedly, watching the brine settle into a stable layer across the top. He measured its clarity with the lamp's faint glow, searching for any sign the mixture had thinned or cooled too rapidly. By dawn, the process reached its most critical phase. The brine had drawn enough moisture from the meat to halt immediate spoilage, but it needed one more cycle of adjustment to ensure stability. Brooks signaled for additional heated water, and 2 soldiers stepped forward to carry buckets from the small stove behind the wall. There was no ceremony to the moment, just steady hands, quiet determination, and the understanding that failure here would render every effort meaningless. The battalion watched from a distance, balancing their anticipation with the reality of the situation. They were nearly at the point where hunger interfered with decision-making. Men struggled to maintain alertness in their foxholes. Machine gunners rotated more frequently to keep their hands steady. A squad leader reported one of his youngest soldiers had nearly fainted on patrol. The battalion commander reviewed these reports with growing concern. They needed food soon. Not in days, hours. It was at this moment, when pressure balanced on a knife's edge, that Brooks began the final steps of the process. He lowered his hand into the barrel, checking the temperature and salinity with the familiarity of someone who had done it for most of his life. There was no scientific instrument, no precise gauge, just the intuition of a man shaped by years of working with salt, meat, and the fragile window where preservation held. After a long pause, he nodded toward the other cooks. They lifted the first piece of preserved meat from the barrel. It was firm, dense, and reduced in moisture exactly as Brooks intended. The medical officer moved closer, examining the cut with clinical scrutiny. He pressed the surface gently, tested its smell, and checked for discoloration. Every soldier in the room seemed to hold the same breath. When the officer finally gave a short nod, the tension that had gripped the battalion eased for the first time in days. Brooks immediately ordered the meat trimmed, sliced, and set to boil in a large pot. The preserved pieces needed careful preparation to avoid overwhelming saltiness, and the water had to be cycled twice. The cooks knew these steps instinctively, performing them with the speed of men who understood the weight of time. Soldiers gathered near the doorway, drawn by the unmistakable scent rising from the pot. It was not appetizing in any traditional sense. It was sharp, mineral-heavy, and earthy, but it carried the one quality the battalion needed most: nourishment. The first ladleful went to the medical officer, who tasted it cautiously, then delivered his assessment with quiet certainty. "It will hold." Those 3 words spread through the farmstead like a signal flare. They did not shout, cheer, or celebrate. Instead, they rested their backs against the walls, allowed exhaustion to release its grip, and understood that for the first time since their isolation began, survival had become possible. The cooks distributed the first servings to the most fatigued squads. Soldiers took the hot bowls with both hands, their movements slow but reverent. They ate without speaking, absorbing the strength the food returned to them. Even a modest portion brought immediate clarity, shoulders straightened, faces steadied, and voices regained calm. The battalion commander observed his men, recognizing how close they had come to losing the cohesion that made a fighting unit functional. The difference a single meal made was undeniable. As the day progressed, Brooks repeated the preservation cycle with precision. The barrel, once dismissed as a useless object, now functioned as the battalion's lifeline. Soldiers assisted in rotating ingredients, boiling water, and maintaining a constant process of preparation. The preserved meat and brined vegetables became the foundation for a steady rhythm of small, nutrient-dense meals that kept hunger at bay. It was not abundance, but it was enough. German forces intensified their probing attacks, attempting to sense whether the Americans were weakening. Machine gun bursts tested their resolve, while mortar rounds edged closer to the farmstead's courtyard. But the battalion held its fire discipline, its defensive line intact, and its confidence renewed. They were no longer counting the hours to collapse. They were counting the hours they had regained. The officers took note of the change. Reports sent back through sporadic radio contact began to shift in tone. Instead of describing imminent breakdown, they now spoke of stabilized readiness. The battalion could hold. They could fight. They could survive long enough for relief forces to break through the German cordon. By the afternoon, the first signs of restored energy appeared in the men's posture and reactions. Patrols moved more deliberately. Machine gun teams regained their measured rhythm. A squad leader reported that his men were alert and steady again. The medical officer confirmed that even small portions of the preserved food were reversing the fatigue symptoms he had been tracking. Through it all, Brooks remained at the barrel, monitoring its contents with unwavering focus. He adjusted brine levels, checked for temperature changes, and ensured every step of the process met the standard necessary to sustain the battalion. His quiet diligence had become a center of gravity inside the farmstead, a reminder that survival was being shaped not only by rifles and tactics but by skill, patience, and the resolve of a single cook who refused to let his unit fall. That momentum carried the battalion into the moment when the siege reached its decisive peak, and the salt barrel's true impact would be tested under the greatest pressure they had yet faced. As the second evening settled over the ridge, the Germans escalated their pressure. Their patrols began pushing closer to the American perimeter, testing weak points, listening for signs of collapse. Mortar fire landed in tighter groupings, guided by observers who had noted where the battalion sheltered its wounded and where movement clustered around the farmstead. The Americans responded with measured bursts, conserving ammunition while holding firm on the terraces that anchored their defense. Inside the command post, the officers assessed the battalion's readiness. The difference between that moment and the previous morning was unmistakable. Men who had struggled to stay upright now moved with purpose. Voices carried strength again. Even the medics noted improvements in coordination among the riflemen. Brooks's preserved food had not transformed the battalion into a fresh unit, but it had given them enough energy to function, fight, and endure. That margin meant everything. Late that night, a German probing assault hit the left flank with sudden ferocity. Machine gun fire cut across the terrace walls while riflemen advanced under the cover of darkness. The American squad holding the position reported immediate contact, requesting reinforcement. The battalion commander ordered 2 squads forward, moving them along the inner wall where they could advance unseen. They reached the line as German grenades shattered against the stones. The Americans fought with a resolve that surprised even themselves. Their movements were sharper, their reactions more coordinated. Soldiers who had barely been able to hold their rifles 2 days before now fired with precision. The preserved rations had stabilized blood sugar, restored strength to weakened muscles, and allowed the men to maintain the discipline required under night assault. They repelled the attack within minutes, leaving the slopes scattered with the remnants of the German push. At the same time, the cooks maintained their cycle without interruption. Brooks checked the barrel between shell impacts, adjusting the brine level whenever vibrations displaced the mixture. He prepared additional portions through the night, knowing the men returning from the line would need immediate nourishment. The kitchen area had become a strategic point within the farmstead. If it failed, the battalion's renewed strength would vanish as quickly as it had returned. The commander visited the cooks briefly, watching the process with unfiltered respect. He understood what the salt barrel represented, not a miracle, but a practical solution executed with precision under conditions where mistakes carried the weight of lives. He spoke only once, thanking Brooks, then left to oversee defensive measures. The acknowledgement mattered, to Brooks, but also to the cooks who had followed his lead. They had become part of the battalion's survival in a way few ever expected cooks to be. As the third day began, the Germans launched their heaviest barrage yet. Mortars rained across the ridge, striking the terraces, the courtyard, and the far edge of the farmstead. The walls shook, sending loose fragments across the floor. Soldiers braced themselves, flattening against whatever cover they could find. A direct hit on the courtyard destroyed several crates and equipment left behind from earlier days, but the farmstead's thick stone walls shielded the interior just enough to keep the barrel intact. The assault was not a prelude. It was an attempt to force a breakthrough. German infantry moved forward in coordinated waves, attempting to dislodge the Americans before reinforcements could arrive. Riflemen along the walls fired steadily, machine gun teams rotating positions to avoid drawing concentrated fire. Even weakened, The battalion held its ground with the determination of men who understood they were fighting not only to maintain a ridge, but to protect the fragile balance that kept them alive. During the heaviest moments of the fight, Brooks continued working. He shifted the barrel slightly to protect it from falling debris, shielded the boiling pot with a metal plate, and kept his focus despite the concussions shaking the walls. Soldiers passing through the farmstead for ammunition saw him standing beside the barrel, steady as the stone around him, and they carried that image back into the fight. Leadership did not always come from rank. The German attack failed to break the perimeter, but it drained the battalion's ammunition more quickly than expected. Officers rationed rounds with strict precision, assigning sectors of fire and adjusting defensive positions to compensate. Still, the Americans held the ridge until the assault tapered off in the early afternoon. Then, through the shifting smoke, faint movement appeared on the southern approach. At first the men tensed, expecting another attack. But the silhouettes took shape: American helmets, American rifles, American movement discipline. Relief forces from the supporting regiment had finally broken through the German obstacles along the lower trail. They advanced carefully, expecting resistance, until one of the forward scouts signaled the ridge was still in American hands. When the first relief platoon stepped into the courtyard, they found a battalion battered, exhausted, and bruised, but standing. The commander met them with a simple acknowledgement: they had held long enough. Word spread quickly through the ranks that help had arrived. Soldiers who had fought on near-empty stomachs for days now allowed themselves a moment to breathe. The cooks did not stop working. They prepared the remaining preserved rations for the most depleted men, ensuring the battalion remained stable during the transition. Relief companies distributed fresh supplies, including official rations, but many soldiers insisted on finishing what Brooks had prepared first. It was a quiet gesture of respect, an acknowledgement that the preserved food had carried them through the darkest hours. The ridge had been saved. The battalion had survived. And the salt barrel that had once been a joke had become the reason an entire American unit remained intact when the odds suggested otherwise. The consequences of that survival would ripple into the days that followed, shaping the battalion's recovery and the legacy of the man who made it possible. The arrival of the relief companies marked the first moment of stability the battalion had experienced since the supply line collapsed. Medics moved quickly through the farmstead, checking each man's condition with renewed precision. Dehydration levels, blood pressure, and coordination tests revealed the toll of the preceding days, yet the medical officers agreed unanimously: without the preserved rations prepared in the salt barrel, many soldiers would have crossed into collapse or organ failure. The margin between endurance and breakdown had been far narrower than most realized. Fresh supplies were unloaded at once. Ammunition cases, medical kits, and standardized rations replaced the improvised systems the battalion had relied on. Yet even as new food arrived, soldiers continued to finish the last portions made by Brooks and his team. There was a quiet acknowledgement in doing so, an unspoken understanding that those meals had sustained them when nothing else could. The officers allowed it, aware that morale often hinged on these subtle gestures of respect. Engineers inspected the ridge and surrounding terraces, preparing them for continued use. Though battered, the position remained strategically valuable, and higher command issued instructions to fortify it rather than abandon it. The battalion, however, was temporarily withdrawn to a safer rear zone to recover. As they marched away from the stone farmstead, many soldiers looked back at the structure that had served as their anchor point. The cratered walls, the shattered courtyard, and the patched windows carried the imprint of every hour they had endured there. In the rear area, the battalion entered a period of controlled rest. Medical evaluations focused on stabilizing body weight, restoring electrolyte levels, and monitoring internal strain from prolonged undernourishment. The difference in recovery between soldiers who had eaten from the salt barrel and those who had gone longest without food became clear. The preserved rations had not only prevented starvation, they had mitigated long-term health complications. Several doctors recorded the case in their field notes, marking it as an example of effective improvisation under combat conditions. Officers from the division headquarters visited the battalion days later to gather a detailed account of the ridge defense. The reports highlighted the Germans' sustained pressure, the damaged supply routes, and the inability to deliver standard rations. Yet one detail appeared repeatedly in the testimonies: the cook who refused to surrender to circumstance. Private First Class Alan Brooks's method of using brine and controlled heating to preserve available food drew attention from both logistical officers and medical staff. It was simple, replicable, and potentially life-saving in other isolated engagements. Brooks himself responded with characteristic modesty. When interviewed by a logistics captain, he explained that the technique was standard in civilian preservation. Nothing innovative, nothing extraordinary. But in the context of a combat environment, where improvisation often determined whether units survived or collapsed, his decision carried strategic weight. He emphasized the role of his fellow cooks, refusing to take individual credit. Still, the officers noted his name. Among the men, stories spread quickly. Soldiers recounted how they had mocked the idea of the salt barrel at first, treating it as a desperate field joke. Only later, when physical weakness threatened to undermine their capacity to fight, did the importance of the barrel become clear. The memory of watching Brooks work beside it, steady under fire, focused despite exhaustion, became a reference point in their retelling of the ridge defense. Every company had its own version, but the core remained the same. The battalion had survived because someone refused to give up. Within a week, the battalion returned to partial strength. Reinforced with fresh personnel and resupplied with standard equipment, they prepared to rejoin the broader operations progressing through the mountainous sectors of Italy. The ridge they had held remained in American hands, strengthening the division's position for future advances. Strategically, the outcome preserved momentum in an area where terrain could easily shift the balance of initiative. As the battalion prepared for redeployment, one final inspection of the farmstead was conducted. Engineers confirmed it could continue to serve as a forward post if necessary. The salt barrel remained in its corner, stained, battered, and nearly empty. What it had represented, however, was still present in the men who walked past it one last time before leaving the ridge behind. Their recovery, their survival, and their renewed fighting strength formed the foundation of what came next, shaping the next phase of their campaign in Italy. When the battalion resumed operations, the memory of the ridge remained close to the surface. The events had reshaped how officers viewed supply vulnerabilities, particularly in mountainous terrain where a single landslide, ambush, or blocked mule track could transform a functioning unit into one fighting on the edge of starvation. Reports from the battalion's leadership were forwarded up the chain, emphasizing that resilience depended not only on ammunition or manpower, but on the knowledge and adaptability of those responsible for feeding the troops. Logistical planners took interest. Field kitchens, often overlooked in the broader framework of operational planning, received newfound attention in internal evaluations. Several officers proposed expanding training modules to include emergency preservation techniques similar to what Brooks used. While formal changes were slow to appear, the incident circulated informally among quartermaster units across the theater. Cooks shared the story at staging areas, illustrating how a simple brine mixture had sustained an entire battalion when circumstances narrowed to a single option. Among the soldiers, the story continued to evolve in quieter ways. When new replacements joined the battalion, the veterans recounted the defense of the ridge as a defining moment. The descriptions varied, but they always returned to the same turning point, the moment when the preserved food kept them from collapsing. Brooks himself became an unlikely figure in these accounts, neither a hero in the traditional sense nor a symbol of defiance, but a reminder that ingenuity could be as decisive as firepower. Medical staff also continued to reflect on the incident. Records from the battalion aid station showed how close several men had come to organ failure or hypovolemic collapse. The preserved rations had provided enough sodium, protein, and caloric stabilization to prevent the sharp deterioration seen in prolonged undersupply. One doctor later wrote that without the intervention, the battalion would have remained technically operational, but physically incapable of resisting even a modest assault. It was an understated way of acknowledging how narrowly disaster had been avoided. Division Command eventually sent a commendation recognizing the cooks for their service during the isolated defense. It was not a medal, nor was it intended as one, but it acknowledged their contribution to the battalion's survival. Brooks received a brief note from the Quartermaster Corps, thanking him for demonstrating initiative under pressure. He accepted it with the same quiet composure he had shown on the ridge, returning immediately to routine kitchen duties. For him, the importance of the barrel ended the moment the battalion was fed and stable. Yet the men remembered. In later operations across Italy, whenever supply issues arose, even temporary shortages, even delays measured only in hours, someone inevitably mentioned the ridge, the farmstead, and the battered barrel. The story became part of their shared identity, something that bound them through the shifting front lines and the long months ahead. It served as a reminder that dire moments could be overcome through discipline, cooperation, and the willingness to try something others dismissed. Higher headquarters compiled the battalion's after-action report into a larger operational analysis of the central Italian front. The document focused mainly on terrain difficulties, enemy defensive methods, and the tactical value of holding elevated positions. But buried within its pages was a short section on supply disruptions, noting that adaptability at the company and platoon level had been crucial. Though unnamed, the influence of the salt barrel remained present in those lines, a silent contribution embedded in the official record. As the campaign continued, the battalion integrated fresh replacements, rebuilt its logistical rhythm, and re-established its role within the division. The ridge faded into the distance as they moved north, but its lessons accompanied them. In brief moments of pause, some of the men would recall the hunger, the strain, and the improvised meals that kept them standing. They remembered how close they had come to breaking, and how they did not. The aftermath of that episode was not marked by medals or grand recognition. It lived instead in the quiet confidence of a unit that had endured something few others experienced so intensely. Their survival shaped their understanding of resilience, reinforced their trust in one another, and reminded them that victories were not always measured in captured ground or destroyed enemy positions. Sometimes, survival itself carried its own form of triumph. What remained was the final meaning of that moment. Something larger than a ridge, a barrel, or a single cook's determination, and the broader reflection it left on those who lived through it. The defense of the ridge south of San Pietro became one of those small, almost hidden stories that rarely appear in the sweeping narratives of the Italian campaign. Yet for the men who lived it, the memory endured far longer than the terrain they fought to hold. What stayed with them was not only the intensity of the German assault or the exhaustion of fighting on the edge of collapse, but the moment when their survival depended on something as unremarkable and as vital as a salt barrel and a cook who refused to let the battalion fail. In war, endurance is often framed through the lens of weaponry, strategy, or decisive command. But the battalion learned that resilience also emerges from quieter acts, those rooted in persistence, skill, and the willingness to solve immediate problems with whatever tools exist. Brooks's improvised preservation did not reshape the campaign. It did not decide the fate of armies or shift the direction of fronts. What it did was allow one American battalion to remain intact, to fight another day, and to carry forward its part in the larger struggle. The soldiers understood this long after they left the ridge behind. They carried forward the memory of hunger turned into strength, of weakness steadied by a simple, functional solution. In their recollections, Brooks's work was not seen as extraordinary, it was seen as necessary, as proof that survival sometimes depends on recognizing opportunity where others see only impossibility. The Italian campaign would continue, marked by new battles, new hardships, and new demands. But the lesson of the salt barrel followed the battalion through each stage, that innovation in desperate moments can preserve not only bodies, but the cohesion and spirit of a fighting unit. It reminded them that every role mattered, every skill had value, and every act of steady resolve could alter the course of a moment. In the end, the ridge became more than a defensive position. It became a testament to the truth that victory in war is built not only on force, but on endurance, and that sometimes the strength of an entire battalion can rest on the quiet determination of a single American soldier who chose not to give up.